The Act of Killing is a 2012 transnationally produced documentary by director Joshua Oppenheimer. The film follows the current-day lives of the perpetrators of the Indonesian mass killings that took place between 1965 and 1966. These killers are still very much at large in Indonesia and are treated like celebrities in their locality. Mainly focusing on Anwar Congo, the film asks the perpetrators to reenact their killings in the form of some of their favourite films, including westerns, gangster films and musicals. The result is both absurd and disturbing, as we are taken into the minds of these killers to explore their motives and mindset for committing these acts of violence. In this video essay, I am going to discuss the act of killing in regards to three main areas. Firstly, I will give some historical background on the mass killings of 1965, their effect on Indonesia, and is subsequently leading to the making of the film. Then I will discuss the ethics of making this film in regards to both its content and its form. Finally, I will be discussing the effect the film had on Indonesia. Indonesia's army was very anti-communist in the 1950s and feared the rising numbers of communist parties like the PKI. In 1959, the Indonesian army forced President Sukarno to stop all further elections, creating a country governed by martial law. America supported them, seeing the rise of communist parties like the PKI as a threat and fearing what could happen if Indonesia became a communist nation while they were still involved in Vietnam. Then in 1965, after a failed left-wing coup, 6 Indonesian army generals were assassinated, and a group calling themselves the 30 September movement took President Sukarno, quote, under their protection. What ensued was what Bradley Simpson in his book Economists for Guns called an army-led and US-backed campaign of extermination. The army led a nationwide killing spree of alleged communists, whom they blamed for the coup, despite there being no proof of their involvement. The army outsourced the killing to local gangs and militias like the Pancasila Youth paramilitary and the Men We Follow in the act of killing. They didn't just kill alleged communists though, also killing thousands of ethnic Chinese people, critics of the military, and innocent Indonesian civilians. In 1 year, at least 500,000 people had been killed and over 1 million imprisoned. President Sukarno was quickly replaced by military leader General Suharto, and by 1965 he was officially ruling over Indonesia with his right-wing New Order administration. Despite Suharto resigning in 1998, this same regime that ordered these killings is still in charge of Indonesia. Institutions like the International Criminal Court have ignored these killings, as has the world's superpowers. This has resulted in a country instilled with fear, where mass murderers are treated like celebrities and aren't held accountable for their crimes. This is the world that Joshua Oppenheimer walked into in 2004. He has described it in many interviews that it was like going into Germany 40 years after the war and still seeing the Nazis in charge. The act of killing was widely critically acclaimed for its innovative style and raw and terrifying content. However, it wasn't without its concerns from viewers, and there were a number of ethical questions raised about the making of the film. I am going to cover the 3 most popular questions raised. Firstly, should Joshua Oppenheimer have paid more attention to the victims of these killings rather than the killers? Secondly, should these mass murderers be given a platform to speak and reenact their crimes? And finally, does the film glorify violence? One of the most common concerns and fair criticisms of the film is that it doesn't give a voice to the victims, instead choosing to focus solely on the perpetrators. When watching the film, this is a fair judgment. We see victims continuously throughout the film, sometimes being threatened, sometimes going along with the perpetrators, or sometimes hiding in the background. When examining the history of the making of the film, the reason for this becomes much clearer. Oppenheimer was originally sent to Indonesia to help a group of plantation workers create a film about their struggle to form a union in the aftermath of the Suharto dictatorship. After finishing that film, some of the Indonesians wanted him to make another film with them about why they were afraid in their own country. This led him to meet Adi, who is the main character of the Act of Killing's 2014 follow-up, The Look of Silence. Adi is the younger brother of Ramli, who had been tortured and killed during Suharto's regime. His family couldn't even talk to him about what happened to his brother and he had grown up terrified and searching for answers. So Oppenheimer started gathering survivors to interview, but after only 3 weeks the army intervened. They threatened everybody to not take part in the film. Instead of giving up, the survivors asked Oppenheimer to go film the perpetrators. Indonesia wouldn't talk about what had happened and they wanted to find out the truth. Once that Oppenheimer became a bit more well known in Indonesia, he made his follow-up, The Look of Silence, which focuses more on the victims of the killings. This information changes my outlook on the film. It changes from the film appearing to ignore the victims to Oppenheimer just trying to protect them. This leads me on to the second question raised in the film. Should these killers be given a platform to tell their stories and reenact their killings? Oppenheimer claims that he wanted to find out the psyche of these men and how they could live with the amount of pain they've caused. And yes, they are indeed interesting to study, but does that mean that they should be given this massive platform? As one viewer pointed out at a secret Indonesian showing of the film, Anwar always wanted to be a film star, and now, because of these terrible acts that he committed, he is. But perhaps it's not so much the fact that the perpetrators have been given a platform to tell their stories, but is instead how that story is told that raises questions. Some critics have questioned the morality of having the perpetrators recreate their killings. One Indonesian critic even suggested that the title should be changed to A Celebration of Killing. Barry Collins quotes in his article on human rights cinema that to have the perpetrators legitimize and reenact their crimes on camera courts a morally obscene degree of impunity and may be seen as endorsing a sympathetic portrait of, quote, traumatized heroes. I can agree with this statement to a certain extent. While I don't believe Oppenheimer ever presents these characters as heroes, he does appear to present us with these traumatized souls, and he hopes that by having them reenact their killings, they may come to the realization that what they did was wrong. He says in his interview to Al Jazeera that
that crimes against humanity have never been committed by monsters, have always been committed by human beings like us. And if we want to have any chance of preventing such crimes in the future, we had better understand how human beings like ourselves do these things.
although many of the perpetrators in the film show no remorse for the things they've done, including torturing, killing, or raping, Oppenheimer chose to try a different technique to help Anwar realize the pain he's caused. In the final moments of the film, we see Anwar watch his reenactments. He appears to finally show some remorse. He does appear to be acting and putting it on, but as Oppenheimer himself said in an interview with executive producer Earl Morris, that the heaving on the roof at the end of the film is both one more performance for us and for him, and the result of something real. A performance that allowed the past to hit him unexpectedly. It's hard to know whether this is just wishful thinking though. Oppenheimer even says that he doesn't want to think about what it would mean if this final moment of realization has no truth behind it. I am unsure of where I land on this point. While the film is ultimately good in opening up discussion in Indonesia and giving the victims' families some answers, the reenactments still leave a sick feeling after watching. But maybe that's the point. While the reenactments are absurd and understandably upsetting to Indonesian audiences, perhaps it was the best way to get these perpetrators to open up, for the Indonesians to finally know what happened, and hopefully to get a conversation started after 40 years of silence. The last ethical question I am going to briefly discuss is, does this film glorify violence? Nick Fraser of the Guardian newspaper calls it a tasteless snuff film, but given the point I've made before, I have to disagree. However, I do feel like parts of the film does immunise us to the violence. While I don't believe that the film tries to glorify these killings, some of the reenactments are so absurd that they can make us forget that these are real-life events that happened. Carnegie Council have a great article called Ethics on Film, a discussion of the act of killing, where they speak about the role murder and violence plays on our everyday lives. In it they talk about how despite humans killing each other routinely, it is still one of the most common actions that people act out. Kids from a young age use their fingers as guns. Millions play video games where the objective is to kill people. and thousands of films have been made that centre around some sort of killing or mass violence. The end of their article claims that the act of killing forces us to understand that when the act of murder is taken lightly, it is immensely easier for these murders to take place. So no, I don't think the film glorifies violence. I do think that at times we become immune to the violence in some of the reenactments, but as the Ethics on Film article suggests, I think that's more a commentary on society's passiveness to violence than on the film trying to glorify it. It would be remiss of me to discuss the act of killing without discussing its impact on Indonesia. The act of killing is technically banned from Indonesia. Instead of a typical theatrical run, it has been shown at private screenings and passed around. The initial response was mixed. Some citizens believed it gave them the answers they were looking for, while some deemed it as an insensitive handling of such important events in their history. There is, however, no denying the widespread reach that the film garnered from politicians to social activists. Soon after the film was released, the presidential spokesman for Foreign Affairs, Teuku Fahsaya, gave a quote saying, "Indonesia is portrayed as a cruel and lawless nation. The film portrays Indonesia as backwards, like in the 1960s. Indonesia has gone through a reformation. Many things have changed. We will settle the issues of our bleak past, but it certainly cannot be done in an abrupt way." It was hard for many to understand what he meant by abrupt, considering the killings were almost 50 years ago at that stage. While the government still hasn't openly discussed the killings, the film led to a human rights petition. Soon after the film was released, the Indonesian National Commission on Human Rights declared that the systematic prosecution of alleged members of the Indonesian Communist Party after the failed 1965 coup was a gross human rights violation. They demanded that the government issue a formal apology to the victims and their families, and that it is followed with rehabilitation, reparation, and compensation. They also gathered 349 witnesses and urged that the military officials involved in the purge be brought to trial for rape, torture, and murder cases. Later that year, the Attorney General's office rejected the plea to open an official investigation into the alleged human rights abuses of 1965. While the perpetrators of the 1965 killings may still be yet to be prosecuted, I believe the film has done a lot for human rights in Indonesia. If nothing else, it has allowed a conversation to be started. While it can still be debated on whether some of the filmmaking choices were ethically correct in the act of killing, I think it is fair to say that it was a film that needed to be made for Indonesia. Hopefully it will open the doors for Indonesians to start having real conversations about the events of 1965 and to make sure nothing like this ever happens again.